Christianity is one of the most widely distributed religions in the world. It developed in Asia along with the other widely distributed religions. Within Christianity is a large array of plants that are used as metaphors, as symbols, and as elements of traditions. Within this episode, we're going to look at some of these traditions and the roles that plants play in them. And it's important to realize that the roles of plants within Christianity developed over many, many thousands of years from tribes of nomads in deserts brought up through agriculturalists and on up into the modern world. And these traditions continue to change and evolve, and plants continue to be a part of those traditions. Every one of us has a worldview, and a worldview is made up of lots of different beliefs that we have about the way that the world works, the way things are supposed to work, and the way things really do, and why they are sometimes not exactly perfect. And people have worked out large systems that deal with addressing these differences between the way that the ideal is and the way things happen to be. Some of the ways that we organize this information include specialized language terms. We oftentimes have underlying assumptions about the way that things work, and we often include elements from earlier worldviews or cultures. And what I mean by this is that all of us have received the kinds of ideas that we have that are contained within our worldview from someone else, either from our parents, from friends, from leaders, or somebody else that you know. And they received it from somebody else. And all of this is kind of a long history going back in time where each generation has made modifications and developed new concepts, and some of those are passed on to the next generation and some are not. And so we really have lots of elements of earlier worldviews, and much of the content of this particular episode deals with the plant material that has come down through religions and the ways in which that represents worldviews of the past. Worldviews are typically encapsulated within religions. And so there's lots of different kinds of religions. This list illustrates some of the ways in which these are categorized as polytheistic, meaning there's many kinds of deities, animistic, and ancestor worship, meaning that the deities are really your bygone ancestors, or they are animals or other creatures out in the world. Monotheism, which means worshiping one God and only recognizing one. Monism, which means recognizing no God, and yet you still have a religion that teaches you a way of understanding the world. There's lots of different ways of organizing worldviews, but these are kind of the ways that you see it organized in the literature when it comes to discussing religion. Each religion represents an ideal state of being. Now, this doesn't mean that people actually experience that. In fact, I would contend that it's very rare that people who practice any particular faith actually experience the ideal state of their own faith. And instead, people look at this as something that they're striving towards. So, the ideal state is some kind of perfect condition that people are trying to get to, and they don't always necessarily know how to get there, but they have a pretty good idea of what it is that they want to reach. Oftentimes between where people are and that ideal state, there's a set of do's and don'ts, things that you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. The major religions of the world are interestingly all from a small area of southern Asia. And so if we look at the major religions, there's some commonalities that they have. In addition to the fact that they have traditions of spreading their beliefs to other peoples and eventually spreading these beliefs all the way around the world. So the first is that they're all from this small area illustrated in this map of southern Asia, roughly the area between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean next to India. Each of these traditions has some major written documents that they follow and that provide the canon of belief. And they also have some minor texts that are upheld, and a lot of times these minor texts are interpretations of the major texts. A key point for our consideration of plants and in religions is that the plants that are described in different religions are usually discussed within the historical works of these religions. So it talks about the kinds of plants people were using, and it provides examples of metaphorical stories and other kinds of illustrations that show a role of plants in society. In this episode, we're focusing upon the roles of plants within Christianity and the interplay between Christian beliefs and plants, particularly plants as metaphors and symbols of beliefs. So to understand a Christian worldview, we need to look at the context of the Bible itself as a historical record of peoples in the Middle East. Within this, we find first a set of oral traditions of pre-agricultural groups. These were people who were gathering in desert areas and grasslands. They were practicing different kinds of hunting and some early forms of agriculture. And so there's all the evidences of people doing these kinds of things found in the early parts of the Bible. Secondly, we have the oral traditions of early agricultural nomads, or people who were herding sheep and camels and goats around in the edges of the desert, going from oasis to oasis, and also practicing an arboricultural tradition where they were raising different kinds of trees at the oases. And the primary trees of concern were those of figs and dates and a few other related trees that do well in desertous areas. The third category of information that we have is written history, poetry, and philosophy of arid land agriculturalists who were living in small cities. And their particular literature illustrates the usage of plants such as the agricultural crops, wheat and barley, and growing of grapes or viniculture. And these are kind of activities that would only be found in the context of a people who are settled and are not kind of moving around across the landscape. And so you find elements of all three of these within the Bible, and so you can see that the Bible actually has the metaphors and traditions of kind of three distinct stages of cultural transition from a hunter-gatherer society all the way to people who are very settled agriculturalists who aren't moving very far. And so what this does is you see that within Christian text there are metaphors and symbols drawn from all three of these kinds of levels. And this becomes really important in some of the examples that we're going to show now. So Christianity has its roots within Judaism. And if we consider what Judaism is, Judaism originated in some obscure nomadic tribes in the area of the Arabian Peninsula, maybe southern Iraq. Out of this, there develops a tradition of sedentary agriculture and a larger population, writing, and ultimately a stratified society. There's also a fair amount of empire building that occurs, both by the practitioners of Judaism and by the adjacent nations. And so, of course, this leads to both trade arrangements between the Jewish people and their neighbors, and to conflict between the Jewish people and their neighbors. And so we have lots of other issues where the Jewish people are sometimes their own state, and sometimes they are a sub-district or state of somebody else, and then sometimes they're slaves, and kind of all the stages in between. Christianity then arises as a sect of Judaism, and particularly involves the rejection or supervening of some of the primary Jewish laws. Within Christianity, there is an agovernmental cross-cultural dispersal of people, meaning that without the direction of a government, this belief, this sect of Judaism, distributes itself widely at the time across the Roman Empire and pops up all over the place. And it has nothing to do with the government moving it. It has nothing to do with any other kind of migration of people. It's just simply a spreading of word of mouth and faith across the rather large area. And probably the key to the success of Christianity in its early days is the unifying feature of the Roman Empire, and the fact that people could easily travel thousands of miles and encounter lots of different cultures without fear of getting killed, because you're not necessarily crossing borders, you were in one big empire. And then lastly, as we see Christianity leaving Judaism, there's a great deal of syncretism that occurs, and over the centuries this involves the bringing into Christianity of beliefs of a lot of other peoples that are spread around Europe. Ultimately, not only do we have the ideas and beliefs of non-Christian religions entering Christian ideas, this includes plants, but we also have a shift to where Christianity becomes a part of the government and then becomes a nationalistic position for a large number of nations, particularly in Europe and North Africa. In order to understand the metaphorical and symbolic roles of plants within Christianity, it's important to consider some of the key elements of Christianity. Now, as I go through these, it's really critical to realize that Christianity is not a single belief system, but rather it's a large number of beliefs that are related to each other and have a common root, but are not necessarily the same belief. You know, be a little suspect of what I tell you, and realize that I'm not necessarily speaking for everyone out there who would consider themselves to be a Christian. The first set of these key elements deals with relationships between people and God. So the first of these is that there is an unseen God who created everything. This is a basic supposition that most Christian sects would hold to be true. The second is that each person has a choice to do good or bad. They don't have to do bad, but they choose to do so a lot. Maybe a lot. Maybe all the time, I don't know. But that people can choose to do good as well. The third is that choosing to do bad or evil has a consequence, that you just can't get away with doing wrong things. And the consequence from a Christian perspective is that you become separated from God. And so the ideal state is to be with God, not separated from God. So this is the fundamental basis of a Christian belief system. The second set of key elements that are critical within Christianity and that lend themselves to quite a number of plant metaphors are that although there is this separation that occurs, that God has offered a way for people to overcome the effects of their bad choices. So you're not kind of stuck forever. There's a way out of this hole. And this way out is the key thing that separates Christianity from Judaism, really, which is Jesus. So Jesus is the one who is able to deal with your bad choices and is able to pull you out of the hole that you dig. And thirdly, so here comes Jesus. If you accept the gift that he's created and has paid the price for you for anything bad you've done, then this allows you to have this permanent relationship with God and therefore get to that ideal state ultimately, although it may not get you there immediately. And then lastly, a permanent relationship with God is, for quite a number of Christian sects, fundamentally the definition of what heaven is. Heaven is not some place that's off in the distance. It's something that is a relationship between an individual and God. And that the opposite of this, permanent separation from God, is what is labeled as hell. So if you put all of these kind of key elements of Christianity together, you can use these to try to understand some of the different metaphors and symbols of plants that you see pop up within Christianity. Now it's really important to remember that an awful lot of the metaphors and the roles of these plants predate Christianity and go back into Judaism. So they occur before the time of Jesus, and therefore it means that these metaphors have either been changed as they shifted from Judaism to Christianity, or the same idea has been pulled forward from a prior belief system into the current belief system. And in fact, there's every reason to believe that these metaphors have shifted subtly over time, over the last 2,000 years, and that what we talk about today may not be exactly what people were talking about 2,000 years ago. So this diagram is intended to illustrate what the ideal state for a Christian would be. Jesus is able to address any wrongdoing that an individual has done and allow them to come into a perfect state where they are able to experience all of the benefits here of love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, joy, all of these good things that, nobody would object to any of these kinds of things. So when we next shift to consider the role of plants in Christianity specifically, we're now able to incorporate a lot of these ideas that have come forward. So specifically, Christians will think about plants as being part of what God created. And this is not just the plants, but it's also the environment. And so the idea here is that if God created it, it must be a good thing. And probably something you should be responsible for and respectful of. Now, this obviously doesn't come across in all Christian sects because there's more than a few people who run around whacking things, but that seems to be inconsistent with the actual values of Christianity. The second is that there's an emphasis upon worship of the Creator and not the creation. And so this is different in Christianity from many other kinds of religions where people will actually worship plants or animals or other things. Whereas in Christianity, this is actually considered to be a bad thing. It's inappropriate to actually worship a plant, even though it's something that was created by God. The third is that people choose to be good or bad, and they can also choose to be good or bad towards plants or towards environments. And so there's reason to believe that there's a consequence for this as well. So it could be just as much of a bad thing to be bad to the environment as it is to do some bad thing that you're not supposed to do. And lastly, Christianity holds a fundamental belief that each person is responsible for their own actions and therefore must answer for their own actions. And so this directly relates to how people not only relate to each other, but also how they relate to plants and plant environments. And so, each of us as an individual, under a Christian perspective, is responsible for our actions in the environment. This is taken to the extreme that in the United States and Europe now, there are actually Christian organizations that are environmentalist organizations who are kind of taking this particular perspective to task and have some unusual slogans such as, well, what would Jesus drive? To try and say, maybe we should be more responsible with the kind of vehicles we drive. So, it's very interesting to think about how some of these philosophies play out as far as modern considerations of our relationship with the environment and plants. So, if we just limit ourselves to talking about plants that are mentioned in the Bible, we see that there's at least 230 species that are clearly discussed, and quite a number of other species that are talked about, but we're not totally certain what the modern plant is. So there's a word that's either an ancient Hebrew or Arabic or Aramaic word, but we don't necessarily know for certain what plant that is today. There's some information that's been lost. Most of these species are from deserts and savannas, which kind of makes sense. That's where the ancient practitioners of Judaism lived. So we would expect them to have plants from those areas. It also includes the areas that are adjacent to the Mediterranean. This includes plants that are used as foods, spices, medicines, for psychoactive purposes, for clothing, construction materials, ornamentals. It includes weeds, fungi, both that are eaten and that are poisonous, and quite a number of wild and domesticated species. And these are all discussed in a number of different ways. They're discussed within historical events. So it could be talking about a particular crop that was grown and raised. It could be talking about a famine that occurred. It could be talking about some specific event that happened. They're discussed within poems, songs, and wise sayings, and they're used as metaphors for spiritual ideas. And it's this last issue that I think is probably the most important for us to consider. When a plant is used as a metaphor to discuss a spiritual idea, the real strength of this is that if you teach somebody a spiritual truth that you hold, and you use a plant that they see around them every day, or you use a process such as harvesting plants as part of that metaphor, each time the person sees the plant or does the process, they're reminded of the spiritual truth that you tried to teach. This is a really good teaching skill, and in fact, this same kind of approach of trying to teach people using plants that they'll encounter in their daily lives is exactly one of the things that we've tried to do within this ethnobotany series, where we try to use plants that people are likely to encounter, and therefore they're likely to remember some of the lessons that we've tried to develop in these episodes. So we'll begin our discussion with a plant that probably most Americans think they know a little bit about, but it turns out most Americans actually know very little about, and this is the fig. There's at least 42 mentions of figs within the Bible, and most of the time these are discussed as being symbols of prosperity. Figs are well known around the world as being trees that oftentimes get to be large in structure. Figs produce fruits at times of the year when most other kinds of fruiting trees are not producing fruit. And therefore, there's many animals, including humans, who rely upon figs to get through certain lean times of the year. Figs can also be dried and stored and prepared in a lot of different kinds of dishes. And so there's kind of a rich culinary history that's developed around them. The fig that we're particularly interested in is Ficus carica, which is the common edible fig, although there's several figs that are found in the Middle East that could be part of the discussions in the Bible. The earliest example we have of a discussion of figs is in the Genesis origin account, where fig leaves are supposed to be used to make clothing. And this is the result of people having made a bad choice and suddenly discovering that they're naked and being ashamed of this. This always fascinates me, because clearly the perfect way to live at the time was to be naked, not to be clothed, and you were only clothed because you did something bad. What's also fascinating about this is that we see that amongst a large number of people, particularly in the tropics, who still practice hunter and gatherer lifestyles or have some kind of basic agricultural system, they oftentimes make their clothing out of fig trees, but it's the bark of the fig trees that's used. Probably the most widely used clothing, in fact, prior to a couple thousand years ago was fig bark. And so the fact that the earliest record in the Bible of people wearing clothes points to a fig makes a lot of sense to me as an ethnobotanist. I would expect people to be wearing figs, although probably not fig leaves, probably fig bark. But that's a discussion that I probably better not get into. Isaiah mentions using figs as part of a medicinal remedy, where he uses the fruits to treat skin infections. Figs are used a lot in prophecies as symbols of hope or prosperity, including the statement to sit under one's vine and one's fig tree, which means this is a condition where you are highly prosperous. If you're able to sit under your own vine and your own fig tree, it indicates everything's going pretty good. Lastly, figs serve as symbols of self-destruction. So we have examples of withering fig trees with the loss of fruit due to insects and other issues being an indication that you really don't have your act together. And so if the symbol that's made about you or your future or the future of your people is that you will wither like a fig tree, this is really a bad thing. It says, oh, you were prosperous, you could sit under your own fig tree, but guess what? It ain't going to last forever. And so in the future, no fig tree, you're zonkered. One of the more interesting plants that's discussed in the Bible is actually only discussed 2 times, and this is the psychoactive plant mandrakes. And mandrakes are clearly discussed within the Bible as a symbol of sensuality. The first account is in Genesis, where it's a fertility account, and mandrakes are discussed as being an aphrodisiac and for promotion of fertility. Mandrakes are known to have a psychoactive set of properties that are similar to other members of the Solanaceae, and so it makes sense that they would serve as something that would elevate your senses and could serve as an aphrodisiac. The second mention of mandrakes is in the Song of Solomon, where these are used for their imagery as being the fragrance of intimacy. And so I'll let your minds kind of run wild with that one. And so mandrakes are kind of less discussed plant, but one that has a little bit higher entertainment value, I think. But clearly, we still have an important symbolic role for this plant. Olives and the products of olives are among the more commonly mentioned plants in the Bible. Olives are found all around the Mediterranean and used for a wide number of purposes. And it's both the wood of the olives that's important and the fruits. And the fruits are used in several different ways, as well as the oil that's expressed from them. Fruit oil uses include food, as a hair or skin tonic, and as a sacrificial offering for coronations and for confirmations. And so almost any time that somebody is proclaimed as being something, being a king, being this or that, there is olive oil that's placed upon them, and this is considered to be an important symbol of what has happened to them. Some of the other symbols of olives include the issue of grafting of good varieties onto wild stems. What this involves is that there's a large number of both species and varieties of olives, and many of these species and varieties do not produce good fruit. Olives graft well, however, so people would take a branch from a good fruiting tree and graft it onto the stump of a wild tree or a poorly fruiting variety, and out of this have a tree that's highly functional. And in fact, a lot of times there's a good reason to do this, because the rootstock of many of the wild species is more disease resistant than the domesticated varieties. Second is that olives serve as symbols of peace and friendship. And in fact, you'll see this in many European nations and some UN-type documents and so forth. There'll be a symbol of an olive branch as an indication of peace or of friendship. And the giving of an olive branch is an old Middle Eastern traditional way to symbolize friendship. Olives can also serve as symbols of prosperity and of sovereignty. But probably the two most important roles of olives are in anointing and as a symbol of peace. Olives are mentioned many hundreds of times in the Bible, and when you add in the mention of olive oil and other olive-type products, it's an incredibly large number of times that this plant is discussed. The only other plant that's mentioned as often is that of wheat, and with wheat, we're oftentimes talking about two different kinds of products. The dried mature wheat, which is what we tend to think of, that is usually ground and made into a flour for making bread, and green wheat, that in the ancient Middle East was used and referred to as corn, or what we translate as corn. This is not talking about zea maize, it's talking about wheat that's harvested green and is then roasted and eaten like that. And in fact, when Europeans arrived in North America, they saw Native Americans eating zea maize, and it reminded them of this old tradition of eating green wheat, and so they applied the word corn that they had previously been using to describe practices from the Middle East. Wheat's most often mentioned as in relationship to offerings, particularly with the use of bread, but sometimes just wheat grains. And it's part of discussions about life cycles, and not just physical life cycles, but spiritual life cycles. And there's a lot of equation that occurs between the planting, growth, and harvesting of wheat and other grasses, and a human's life cycle, where you are planted, you grow, and then you're harvested, so to speak. As well as civilization as a whole. This serves as a symbol of planting, growing, and then harvesting. And so within Christian belief systems, it's very easy for people to see a beginning of the world, that's a planting, a time of growth and change, and then an ending of the world. And so the idea that the world has a definite beginning and end is very, very consistent within most Christian sects. Among the many products that wheat is well known for and is discussed within the Bible is the production of bread, production of beer, and using the stems as straw in order to make bricks, baskets, bedding, and mats. And so all of these are uses for the wheat plant. Wheat as a metaphorical symbol is involved in several different kinds of issues. So the first is in agriculture. As I mentioned, it represents the stages of life or stages of other kinds of processes. Wheat within agriculture is also discussed with its relationship to what are called tares. Tares are a kind of weed that oftentimes grows within wheat patches and that is easily hidden. The young plants look very similar, and so it's difficult for the farmer to tell whether to pull the plants or not, because you don't want to pull up your wheat, but you want to get rid of the tares. And so the key of most of the metaphors about wheat and tares is that only the harvester can sort out good and bad, can sort out the wheat from the tares, because you don't want to harvest the tares, you don't want to replant them. And so clearly the emphasis here metaphorically is that God will sort out the good from the bad, and that people, as kind of others, are not really in a position to do that. And then the third agricultural metaphor is the idea of flour and yeast, where there are small actions that impact a whole person. So yeast is oftentimes discussed as being something that you just need a little bit of, and it's able to change the bread that's being made from it in a big way. And so that bread that's being made is made from wheat flour. It's not the wheat flour that was important, it was that tiny bit of yeast that was important. But the flour serves as the matrix in which the action happens. The next most commonly mentioned plant is grapes, particularly grapes that have been converted to wine, so grape juice that's been fermented. Grapes are oftentimes used as a strong symbol of judgment. When we look at some of the products that are mentioned in the Bible, not only do we see the consumption of grapes themselves, we see raisins, wine, and vinegar being produced from these. These are really critical foods. But in addition, wine as a alcoholic beverage was also commonly used as a water purifier. So you would mix water with wine, and this was not necessarily to dilute the wine and make it last longer, but it was probably more to purify the water, because they didn't have any other way of purifying water. These are people who were living in small arid areas where there's not a lot of water. You got to drink the water you can get, and the water is easily contaminated from all of the kinds of things that people are doing around it. So mixing wine with water was probably more of a safety issue than anything else. Among the symbols are those of a vineyard. Vineyards require pruning for successful growth. There's some symbolic relationships between old vines and young branches. The old vines are able to provide lots of energy, water, and nutrients for the plant. The young branches are the places where you get the fruit growing. So you need a combination of both to have a successful system. Vineyards are fragrant when they're in flower, and therefore people who are familiar with the pleasant fragrance of a grape vineyard like that fragrance, and this fragrance becomes a symbol of the kinds of relationships that people have, and the roles of judgment and vineyards. It means that smell relates to judgment is coming. There's an issue about vineyards being protected from animals and enemies. Enemies apparently would swoop down and try to ruin somebody else's vineyard, and you, of course, wouldn't want this to happen, because having that wine was really important, at the very least to clean up your water supply, but probably for more entertaining uses than that. And so keeping that vineyard safe was really important. And then lastly, the harvest of a vineyard is associated with judgment and evaluation. If you've ever gone through a grape vineyard and watched professionals harvesting, you'll see that they carefully pick off the bunches of grapes that are perfectly ripe, and they discard the grapes that are spoiled in any way, and really separate the good from the bad. And so this is clearly, for people who are accustomed to harvesting grapes and seeing a lot of bad grapes be thrown away, that distinction was really something that was a good metaphor for them to use for judgment or a harvest period. The last plant we'll discuss is the date palm, which is really a plant of the oases and particularly kind of marginal areas around deserts. But it's a plant that provided an essential food for peoples, particularly in the deep past. Date palms are not only a key oasis food, but they also are a fiber source that was really important for ancient peoples. You can eat the dates, the fruits. Honey is made from them, and also wine can be made from that. And they're used medicinally, the dates themselves or the wine from the dates. Date palm leaves can be used to make baskets, although you have to be very careful because the points of the leaves are rather sharp and noxious. They're used as building materials, as leaf thatch. And the needles on them are actually used in some cases as either sewing needles or an awl or for weaving nets, these kinds of things. Some of the symbolism of dates includes that they represent nobility and peace, particularly nobility and peace that involves authority symbols. So you'll see that in many ancient ruins in the Middle East, there will be columns that are shaped like date palm trunks, and at the top of the column there will be symbolic leaves that are growing out of the top of the column, probably carved out of marble or something. And so this is intended to symbolize the nobility and authority of the particular leader who built that structure. Tall old trees stand as symbols of permanence, and in fact many tall old trees are named. And oftentimes these are associated with Asian and African temples, not just any old structure, but the temples, and particularly temples that were intended for the worship of a particular king or deity that probably represents a former king. In addition, date palms are symbols of grace and elegance. And in fact, this is the reference that's used when we look at the Semitic or Arabic and Hebrew words for a date palm. The word that is used is tamara, which means grace or elegance. So just to give you an idea of how much plants are mentioned within the Bible, what I've done is I've selected a passage out of the Song of Solomon that lists a lot of plants in it. I did this on purpose, so this is not exactly a representative sample, but it is a sample where you get to see a lot of plants used in a lot of different symbolic ways. And so I'm going to have a man and woman read this. This was intended to be represented as being read by both a man and woman. And so you'll hear what the man says, and then you'll hear the woman's response to it. And while they're reading this, I want you to look at this list of the plants that are discussed and think about kind of the meanings that are involved.
Beautiful are your feet in sandals, O prince's daughter. The curves of your hips are like jewels, the work of the hands of an artist. Your navel is like a round goblet which never lacks mixed wine. Your belly is like a heap of wheat fenced about with lilies. Your two breasts are like fawns, twin gazelle. Your neck is like a tower of ivory. Your eyes like the pools in Heshbon by the gates of Bath-rabbim. Your nose is like the tower of Lebanon which faces toward Damascus. Your head crowns you like Carmel, and the flowing locks of your head are like purple threads. The king is captivated by your tresses. How beautiful and how delightful you are, my love, with all your charms. Your stature is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I said, I will climb the palm tree. I will take hold of its fruit stalks. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the fragrance of your breath like apples, and your mouth like the best wine. It goes down smoothly for my beloved, flowing gently through the lips of those who fall asleep.
I am my beloved's, and his desires for me. Come, my beloved, let us go out into the country. Let us spend the night in the villages. Let us rise early and go to the vineyards. Let us see whether the pomegranates have bloomed. There I will give you my love. The mandrakes have given forth fragrance, and over our doors all our choice fruits, both new and old, which I have saved up for you, my beloved. Oh, that you were like a brother to me who nursed at my mother's breast. If I found you outdoors, I would kiss you. No one would despise me either. I would lead you and bring you into the house of my mother who used to instruct me. I would give you spiced wine to drink from the juice of my pomegranates.
So as we've seen, there's many plants that play important roles within Christianity, both as metaphors, as traditional symbols, and within the practices of Christian faith. This is similar to each of the other great religions of the world, and one of the interesting things is that we see many of these plants around us, although we don't always think about their symbolism. And likewise, some of the symbols that are represented that we've been discussing are played out in daily life in a lot of different ways. We talk about these things, and yet we don't realize their origin, nor the fact that these originated in religions and continents far away from here.